Some things are impossible to miss, like an elephant in the room, or a bull in a china shop, or this season's amazing offers, brought to you by PayPal. Discover offers from hundreds of brands like Viator, Allbirds, and Tory Burch right in the PayPal app. Save an offer before you check out with PayPal and earn unlimited rewards. Download the PayPal app to get started. Terms and exclusions apply. See paypal.com/rewards terms.
Chronic migraine, 15 or more headache days a month, each lasting 4 hours or more, can make me feel like a spectator in my own life.
Botox, onabotulinum toxin A, prevents headaches in adults with chronic migraine. It's not for those with 14 or fewer headache days a month. It's the #1 prescribed branded chronic migraine preventive treatment.
Prescription Botox is injected by your doctor. Effects of Botox may spread hours to weeks after injection, causing serious symptoms. Alert your doctor right away, as difficulty swallowing, speaking, breathing, eye problems, or muscle weakness can be signs of a life-threatening condition. Patients with these conditions before injection are at highest risk. Side effects may include allergic reactions, neck and injection site pain, fatigue, and headache. Allergic reactions can include rash, welts, asthma symptoms, and dizziness. Don't receive Botox if there's a skin infection. Tell your doctor your medical history, muscle or nerve conditions, including ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, myasthenia gravis, or Lambert-Eaton syndrome, and medications, including botulinum toxins, as these may increase the risk of serious side effects.
Why wait? Ask your doctor, visit BotoxChronicMigraine.com, or call 1-800-44-BOTOX to learn more.
Atheists, agnostics, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm political scientist Michael Baranowski, an emeritus professor at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is Lamar Alexander, who, in a nearly 60-year career in public service, has been a 2-term governor of Tennessee, chair of the National Governors Association, president of the University of Tennessee System, secretary of education, a presidential candidate, and a 3-term United States senator from Tennessee. Honestly, I'm betting there's not much he hasn't seen in his long and distinguished career, and so I am just thrilled to be talking to him today about his recently released book, The Education of a Senator. Senator Alexander, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me.
So I thought I'd start with kind of talking about getting your view on the state of Washington, because, of course, Washington, D.C. these days, and for a while, I think, has been kind of synonymous with gridlock and dysfunction. There was a recent poll that showed disapproval of Congress at 86%. That's a record high, not the kind of high you want to hit. And so I'm wondering, how do you convince a skeptical listener, and that's probably most listeners to this show, that what you've termed the Senate's function screen is the real story when it's the dysfunction screen is what so many of us see day after day after day?
Well, let me give you an example. That's probably the best thing. And I was there during President Trump's first term. And I live in East Tennessee, the Smoky Mountains, and a big guy named Ryan Zinke came to see me. He was a former SEAL. He jumped out of helicopters 700 times or more. He said, I want you to introduce a bill that would take money from drilling on federal lands and use that money to maintain our national parks. There's a big maintenance backlog on the national parks. Well, that's a really hard thing to get done. I mean, gridlock, which you mentioned, would stand in the way of that. The Office of Management and Budget says no to that. The money should be used for reducing the debt. Louisiana senators say no to that. We want it for our coastal restoration. Western Republicans say no to that because they think the federal government already has too much land. Democrats would say no to it because they don't want to do anything with Donald Trump. Donald Trump would say no to it because he doesn't want to do anything with them. So the long and short of it was, during 2019 and 20, a group of senators on both sides of the aisle, Mark Warner, for example, and Rob Portman, Democrat, Republican, worked with 800 outdoors groups and President Trump in an alliance that was unusual, some said unholy, and produced the Great American Outdoors Act, which most people would say, I mean, everyone would say, I think, that it's the most important conservation law since, at least since Eisenhower, maybe since Teddy Roosevelt.
Wow.
So there's an example of how the United States Senate, not very long ago, could work together on a difficult issue, President Trump and 800 outdoors groups, you wouldn't think that would work, and get a result that was a result that people have been trying to pass since the 1960s. It also included the Land and Water Conservation Fund, which had been recommended by Lawrence Rockefeller's commission in 1962. So it can still work. That's what I call the function screen. The dysfunction screen is what you see most of the time on television. The reason I say there's a function screen is it doesn't make much news because it has to do with me having breakfast with Senator Warner and asking him to let Senator Portman be the lead sponsor because we have a Republican problem that we need to overcome and a budget problem we need to overcome. Now, that's not going to make any news. It's kind of in the way that a plane crashing makes news, a plane landing safely doesn't.
Yeah.
I don't want to diminish the fact that the Senate is not today doing what it should. It's not doing everything it should. But if the viewers would watch closely, senators who are working together, you'll find them, and they're getting results.
Now, of course, before you were a senator, you were a number of other things. I mentioned governor of Tennessee. And one of the things in the book that you wrote that I found very intriguing is you write, a good governor needs the skills of both Moses and Count Basie. And I got to say, those aren't two people I would put together normally in my mind. And so I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, Moses, a governor, a governor's job is to say, let's go this way. I mean, here's a problem. The schools aren't good enough. Here's a strategy. Let's pay teachers more for teaching well. And then the third step is you got to persuade half the people you're right. And then in my case, I was working with a Democratic legislature. I'm a Republican. So I had to listen to what they had to say, and they had some different ideas. So in the end, I had to be practical, and we had to get a compromise in order to get a result. So that's what a governor does. He also, or she, does what Count Basie does, which is Count Basie, it was said, could sit down at a piano with the most disheveled group of musicians, tinkle a few keys, and pretty soon they'd be playing better than they ever had before. Yeah. In other words, a governor's job is to try to bring out the best. And so we had something called Tennessee Homecoming 86. We asked all the communities in the state to find something to celebrate, invite everybody to come back and help celebrate it. And we were trying to get Nashville to celebrate being Music City, and Minnie Pearl's hometown south of Nashville to celebrate her, and people who identify something that is good, that's theirs, usually have higher goals and accomplish more. So having those two skills is what a governor needs. Kind of Moses says, let's go this way, and Count Basie brings out the best in the musicians around him, the other people.
And then you went on to say, for a senator, it's a different skill set. You likened an effective senator to a drum major, and I'll let you explain that one too.
Well, a lot of governors have a hard time coming to the Senate because they're used to doing what I just said, which is to be practical, say, let's go this way, and then let's work with the legislature and get a result. Well, they come to the Senate, and they hate it, some of them. Henry Bellman, who was the governor of Oklahoma, and then senator, and then governor of Oklahoma again, said, serving in the Senate is about as exciting as watching a stump rot. Now, this was in the 1970s and the 1980s. And Mitch McConnell says that any United States senator who tells you who's been a governor, who tells you he prefers being a senator, will lie about other things. So a senator's job, you can't be Moses in the Senate. It's 100 people that operates by unanimous consent. So the drum major metaphor I used was you've got to select the music and then recruit the musicians, and then you say, let's go down this path. And then you lead the musicians and you try to keep them from marching into the ditch, and you probably have to let one or two of them march out front as soloists just to get where you want to go. That's kind of the way the Great American Outdoors was passed. By the time we got where we wanted to go, you couldn't say who was really responsible for the success because so many people in the marching band participated in it. So that's a messy, difficult way to lead, and it's something that many governors find absolutely demoralizing. So Governor Mike Johans was the governor of Nebraska and a Secretary of Agriculture, really first-rate person. He served in the Senate for one term. I went to see him and asked him, said, I'd like to encourage you to be a part of the Senate leadership. And his answer was, why would anyone stay here? And he went home after one term.
Yeah, I guess so. You came to the Senate for the first time after being a governor in 2003, and I'm wondering, what was was that the biggest surprise you got, or were there other things? What sort of adjustments did you have to make, and so forth? I'd be really interested in hearing that part of the initial part of your education of a senator.
Well, the initial part went back a long ways. I had an advantage that most of the governors who become senators didn't have, because I worked for Senator Baker in 1967 and 8. And then I worked in congressional relations in the White House in 1969 and 70. And then I was back in Washington as education secretary in the early 90s, working with H.W. Bush in his cabinet. And I worked with the Senate a lot. So I had my eyes pretty wide open. And the biggest surprise for me, I had a pretty good idea of how the Senate worked, and I knew it was different than being a governor. Biggest surprise for me was how many senators I knew. I knew about a quarter of them. I mean, by the time I got to the Senate, I was 62, and I'd done these other things. And so Trent Lott used to be my roommate when I was a young man living in Washington. Bill Frist lived up the street from me in Nashville. I ran into Judd Gregg when I was campaigning for president. He was running Bob Dole's campaign. So there were about 25 of them that I already knew, and that was of an enormous advantage because the Senate is built on relationships. And if you already have a relationship and some trust, you're more likely to get things done.
Yeah. And, there's this old saying about the Senate. Of course, you've heard it. Every senator's heard it. It's every senator looks into the mirror and sees a president. And I'm wondering, do you think there's anything to that? And if so, how does that matter? Because, of course, it suggests that, there's this idea of senators as hyper ambitious, very self-regarding, that sort of thing. It's like herding cats, trying to get senators to do what you want them to do. And I'm wondering, how true is that in your view? You would know.
That's all pretty true. I can give you an example or two where it wasn't, but someone asked Senator Fritz Hollings of South Carolina when he announced for the presidency years ago, said, how many senators think of themselves as someday running for president? And Hollings said, every damn one, every damn day. And senators are a lot like, you can spot a senator in the first grade. He or she will be sitting on the front row with their hand up, hoping to be called on. And from the rest of their life, they're encouraged and patted on the back, and they learn to run for something. And when they get to the Senate, there's nothing left to run for except president. And so a lot of them think about doing that. Now, I'll give you an example of a non-senatorial action. Mike Enzi of Wyoming was a shoe store. He owned a shoe store in Wyoming, and he was impossible to defeat in Wyoming. He spent every weekend with his wife, Diana. They would drive to ice cream socials with 3 people, and he knew everybody in Wyoming. But when it came time for a Republican to be chairman of the Education Committee, it was his turn. And he came to me and said, I think you should do it because I think you would do a better job. And I said, Mike, you don't have to do that. And he said, no, I think you'd do a better job. And I'm an accountant, and I'd be happy being chairman of the Budget Committee. And so because of Mike Enzi's unselfishness, I got to be either ranking Republican, senior Republican, or chairman of the Education, Health, Labor, Pensions Committee for 6 years with Presidents Obama and Trump, and was able to get a lot done because I had that position. Now, that's pretty unusual. Another example is, I mentioned it earlier, Mark Warner from Virginia, who's still there, had sponsored a bill that turned out to be the Great American Outdoors Act. He knew it. He and his staff knew that it would be the most important conservation law in a long time. And I went to him and asked him if he would step back and let Senator Portman from Ohio be the lead sponsor, because Portman was a Republican. He'd been the budget chairman. And the obstacles we had were more in the Republican Party and more with budgetary issues. So Warner stepped back and agreed not to be the lead sponsor of the most important conservation legislation since at least Eisenhower, and that was an unselfish act. So there are a lot of elbows flying in the Senate, but not always.
Yeah. Well, I wonder, because when I think about the great senators of the past or even the fairly recent times, someone like, say, Mitch McConnell, who, even if you don't like his politics, it seems to me he was incredibly effective at leading the Senate. And yet he didn't have, it seems to me, grand presidential ambitions. And I'm wondering if some of the more effective senators are actually people who have either don't have those ambitions or gave them up, essentially.
I think you're exactly right. From the time Mitch was in high school in Louisville, he wanted to be a United States senator. And it wasn't very long after that he wanted to be the United States Senate leader. And he didn't want to do anything else. That was his goal, and he got there. And because that was his focus, he was very good at it. He served at it longer than anybody. And in my own case, I succumbed to the run for something impulse that every senator has. I ran for leadership in the Republican conference. First time I ran, Trent Lott, my old roommate, beat me by one vote.
Oh.
And I told my Republican colleagues, said, I'm going to write 27 thank you notes for 24 votes because I thought I had enough votes. But then I was elected chairman of the Republican conference a couple of years later, and I stayed in that 3 or 4 years. But I left that job because I got tired of the political part of it. And I thought I used to say to my colleagues in the Senate, hard to get here, it's hard to stay here, and while you're here, you might as well try to accomplish something good for the country. I thought I could do more outside leadership. It helped to have a friend who was leader, McConnell, and I got along most of the time with Schumer, who was the Democratic leader, but I got more done as an independent senator. I felt freer to advocate my own views and to work across party lines and to try to get results.
Yeah. And, it seems to me you were in the Senate at a very interesting time, 18 years from 2003 to 2021. To me, that's an era of a significant amount of change in American politics, at least. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what changed the most during that time, both in terms of kind of how things operated within the Senate, which I wonder if at the end of that, at least at the beginning of that period, maybe there was still at the end of that kind of more collegial sort of period, or also just in terms of campaigning or American politics in general, whatever comes to mind, really.
Well, you're perceptive, I think. My years were 2003 to 2021. And politics, just like most of our society, changed dramatically in 2008. There were several reasons for it. President Obama's election, he was an atonement for the original sin of slavery in the eyes of many, and he was very able, but he was too liberal for many other people. Then there was the Great Recession, which created a lot of unease. Then there was the effect of globalism on American communities, and so the idea that, like my dad had his job at the Alcoa plant his whole life, that didn't happen anymore. People every 3 or 4 years found their jobs going out from under them because of our competition in the world. And then the biggest thing, of course, was the arrival of social media. The Facebook and the iPhone made their debut about that same time, about 2008, and the evil algorithm came upon the American scene and began to tell us through our digital devices only the things that we really already believed or wanted to hear, whether it was sports or politics or whatever it was. If you were interested in X, that's all they made sure you got that back. So it drove politics to the extreme, and it wasn't long before President Trump arrived in the middle, in 2016, and we had a different kind of politics. So today, 80% of the American people live in states where one party dominates the state, and we don't have that kind of competition that produces, I think, good government. In Tennessee terms, say it would be like the University of Tennessee playing Murray State every Saturday. I mean, it'd be 70-4, 70-6.
Yeah.
Well, nobody would want to go see that game, and if that was all there was every Saturday, and a lot of people wouldn't want to participate in it.
Yeah.
When we had a robust two-party system in Tennessee, which was from about the 1960s through about 2008. It attracted a lot of really good people like Bill Frist and Fred Thompson, Bob Corker and Al Gore and Phil Bredesen on the other side, who could do other things but thought politics was a great place for them to be. It looked like fun. It looked like a purposeful place. And because they were talented, when they got elected, we got better government.
Toward the end of your Senate tenure, not quite at the end, but 2018, Senator Ben Sasse wrote something that really resonated with me and I think a lot of other people. This is an op-ed piece, I believe, in the Wall Street Journal, and he wrote, "For the past century, more legislative authority has been delegated to the executive branch every year. Both parties do it. The legislature is weak, and most people here in Congress want their jobs more than they want to do legislative work, so they punt most of the work to the next branch." And I'm wondering if you agree with that in part or in whole, and if so, what do you see as the main things driving this decline in Congress that Senator Sasse describes?
Well, he's right about the result. And over the last number of years, the executive has taken on more and more authority. I mean, if I were going to make one suggestion to my former colleagues in the Senate today, which I don't do, I figure I'm not a senator anymore, but if I were going to make a suggestion, I would say, have a bipartisan breakfast meeting once a week and read the Article 1 of the Constitution to each other, because in it will remind you that the Congress is in charge of every appropriation, and the Congress is in charge of every tariff, and the Congress is in charge of every tax. The Congress is in charge of declaration of war, and the states are in charge of elections. And right now, even on those things that are expressly in the Constitution given to the legislative branch in Article 1, the Senate isn't exercising that authority very often. A few are. I mean, Rand Paul is the one who most consistently does. Ted Cruz did the other day when he took on the FCC chairman, said he was acting like the mafioso by trying to cancel TV programs because of what people said on TV. And other Republicans are doing more, but it's the federal courts have preserved what's left of Article 1 for the legislature. Yeah. Why are they doing that? I think part of the reason is because they're afraid of primaries, because the extremes in the primary on the right and the left discourage people who work to get a result on taxes, on tariffs, on the things that the Congress is supposed to do.
When you're taking on the tough jobs, gear up with Venom steel gloves and defend your hands from grime, grease, and muck. They're 70% thicker than common disposable gloves with heavy-duty 2-layer nitrile protection, including a black outer layer and a white inner layer that provides chemical and rip resistance. Great for all your painting, plumbing, automotive, and DIY projects.
Starting a business can seem like a daunting task, unless you have a partner like Shopify. They have the tools you need to start and grow your business. From designing a website to marketing to selling and beyond, Shopify can help with everything you need. There's a reason millions of companies like Mattel, Heinz, and Allbirds continue to trust and use them. With Shopify on your side, turn your big business idea into... Sign up for your $1 per month trial at shopify.com/special offer.
There's this, at least image I have, of the Senate in the days of yore, I'll say, where there were a lot of events. The cloakroom was a happening place, and they had dinners and things like that, and they were well attended and really part of the social lives of a lot of senators. And I get the sense that has really dwindled away to very little. I'm wondering, first, am I right in that? And second, how much does that matter in your view?
Matters a lot, and you're right. When I first went to the Senate as a staff member in the late 1960s, many senators lived in Washington. They were there for the weekends. They went home for long summer breaks or things like that. Their children went to school in Washington. So they got to know each other. And if you get to know each other, even if you're of different parties, you might find some things you learn to trust each other, or you learn if you can trust each other, and you might find something you can agree on. But if all you're doing is flying back up there for a Monday night vote and then leaving on Thursday afternoon, you don't have that experience. Plus, there wasn't the huge demand for fundraising that occupies the time of many of the senators. Yeah. To try to deal with that, during my 18 years in the Senate, my wife and I, Honey, we invited about 60 different couples from the Senate to spend the weekend with us here at our home at the edge of the Smoky Mountains, 2 or 3 couples at a time. I mean,
Wow.
the Schumers, the McConnells, Patty Murray, Michael Bennett, lots of different people. And we didn't talk about politics. We mainly talked about bears and grandchildren and took hikes and got to know each other better. And that was something of a substitute for that. But it's not brain surgery. But if you don't know each other, you don't trust each other, and you're not likely to find something you can agree on.
Yeah.
I mean, Patty Murray and we worked together for 6 years, my last 6 years. She's very liberal. Her staff is even more liberal, and she's a part of the Democratic leadership. So there's a lot we don't agree on. I mean, I'm conservative. I'm a very Republican, but we got a lot done because we listened to each other. And for example, when I became chairman and said, we're going to fix No Child Left Behind, I'll introduce a bill and we'll let the Democrats amend. But she said, no, we won't. We'll write it together or we won't have one at all. Well, I could have said, well, pooey on you. I'm the chairman. This is the way we'll do it. I said, no, okay, we'll do it your way.
Yeah.
And we got a result that most people thought was impossible to get. In fact, President Obama called it a Christmas miracle.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier you ran for president. That was in 1996, and then at least you put your toe in the waters in 2000. And I'm wondering, what was the biggest lesson you learned from that experience?
Biggest lesson I learned running for president is that the difference between running for governor and running for president is the difference between 8th grade basketball and the NBA final. With these sports, we sit around and complain about the quarterbacks in the NFL, to take another example. Of course, they're all the top 1% of 1% of 1% of athletes in the world, and we all think they're a bunch of, incompetents. But it's tough. It's a different challenge. Second, I learned it was media and money makes a big difference. When I did pretty well in 1990, came close to winning the New Hampshire Republican primary, which would have given me a chance perhaps to run against President Clinton. 1999, my effort lasted about as long as the Wright brothers' first flight. And I remember when I dropped out, the reporters asked me just the question you asked me, what did you learn? And I said, well, it's all media and money. Now, this is 1999. I said, if we're not careful, in 2004, what we're going to have is Donald Trump versus the latest Powerball winner with Cher as the independent candidate. And everybody laughed.
Yeah. Huh?
And about 12 years later, Donald Trump was the president.
One of the things you wrote in the book about your run for the presidency, you said you wanted to try to persuade a majority of Americans to, in your words, expect less of Washington, D.C. and more of ourselves. And so why should Americans expect less and not more of the federal government?
Because our country is big, decentralized, and doesn't really work from a central place. It's it was founded from the bottom up. First, we had communities, then we had states, then we had a very limited federal government. And that turned out to be very wise because if you've got Catholics and Protestants and Muslims and Southerners and Westerners and people from all over the country, and your idea of a country is that it doesn't matter where you come from, whatever your race, whatever your background, you can be an American, then you've got to leave a lot of room for differences of opinion and differences of style and different decisions. And if you kick all those issues to Washington, D.C. and try to decide them there, the place will blow up. So our freedom is based upon our decentralism, and the structure of our government encourages that. So that's why I think, I'm not ideological about much, but I am about that. I think the less we do from Washington, the more we do community by community, the stronger we'll be as a country.
Yeah. Well, I'm an old Burkean conservative, so I'm all about that kind of lowest level and federalism and that. But it seems like even in the Republican Party, which used to be the home for that kind of thinking, we're seeing less and less of that. And I'm sure you probably saw that evolution during your time in the Senate as well.
Well, I did. Now, the bill that we passed, I mentioned Patty Murray and Obama, the Christmas miracle, we passed a bill to fix No Child Left Behind, which was an accomplishment of George W. Bush, but it put too much of power eventually in Washington. And the end result of the bill, according to the Wall Street Journal, was it sent most school decisions, K through 12, back to states from Washington about how you pay teachers, what a good teacher is, what the curriculum can be. Common Core was a big flashpoint at that time. We said no more Common Core. States can decide that. So the Wall Street Journal said that was the biggest shift of power from Washington to the states in 25 years. So that was good, but I can't tell you the number of times that in the committee that I was on, education, one senator I remember, Senator Harkin, who I was a friend, but a Democrat from Iowa, he said, well, we need to have a dress code for schools. And I said, Tom, dress code might be a good idea, but there are 100,000 schools. And how do you know that, a school in Maryville, Tennessee, and Dubuque, Des Moines, Iowa, or Dubuque are the same? They're not the same. The people there care about their children. They can decide whether they have, wear certain kind of clothes to school. And there's this disease that causes people, when they get elected and go to Washington, to believe that suddenly they become smarter than everybody else. And they come up with, I've got a good idea. Let's make everybody do it. And it comes from the left and it comes from the right. And both of them are wrong.
Yeah. I would not call you a conservative populist, at least not in kind of the current MAGA Trumpian sense. But honestly, when I think of you, I think of that iconic black and red check flannel shirt and your walk across Tennessee, and you did the same thing in New Hampshire later on. That is very kind of man of the people-ish to me. And so I'm wondering, how do you see the distinction between what I'll call MAGA populism and the sort of kind of folksy, down-to-earth image that it seems to me, at least, that you often projected?
Well, I'll give you an example about that. When I did, most people don't even know this, but when I ran for governor the first time in Tennessee in 1974, people said I was a stuffed shirt. So in 1978, at my wife's encouragement, I did something I enjoyed doing. I got 4 guys out of the University of Tennessee marching band, a flatbed truck, put on my red and black shirt, and I walked 1,022 miles across the state over 6 months, and I spent the night with 73 families, and I soaked up how they lived, and I went to church with them. I ate their meals. I slept in their beds, and I got in touch with them. And back then, a big movie was Smokey and the Bandit.
Oh yeah,
Jerry Reed and Burt Reynolds, I guess. And Jerry Reed, he got a red and black shirt, and he climbed up on my flatbed truck. And I mean, those were today's Trump voters. Were the Smokey and the Bandit fans of 1980 and 1991. A lot of rural people, a lot of people who were populists in their attitudes. So I don't think you have to have certain views in order to be down to earth. In fact, I thought that walking across the state, spending the night with people was a lot more honest campaign than all of the photo ops that you stage to pretend that you're in favor of this or against that.
Yeah.
But my views were pretty, I was pretty concerned. I mean, I vetoed the picture driver's license 3 times because I thought it was too much federal government. Yeah. And they wouldn't even let me in the White House one time because I didn't have a photo op driver's license. And I said, well, I can't have one because I vetoed it. And the governor of Georgia had to vouch for me to get me in. And I was I was a Republican who asked President Reagan to get the federal government completely out of K through 12 education, take over Medicaid, and give us K through 12 education. So my views, I think, were pretty conservative, pretty Republican. My style is not to shout at people, but I think walking across the state immersed me and made me in the people of the state, made me a much better candidate and a better governor.
And do you get the sense that in general in politics, but particularly place you know the best, the Senate. There's been a move from, I guess, what I'll call authentic retail politics, kind of going out, meeting people, soaking up their stories and that sort of thing, from the kind of headline seeking that you have decried, and I think rightly so, in other folks?
Well, yes is the answer. I mean, again, that's the social media.
Yeah.
I mean, it's a powerful, powerful thing. I mean, if you say something extreme, you'll get on social media. Somebody else will post it on social media. You can raise a lot of money on social media and get a lot of attention on social media, but you're not likely to be able to do it if you're in the center left or center right. So Warren Buffett's top vice president used to say, "Show me the incentive, and I'll show you the result."
Yes.
And there's no
Yes.
incentive to work the center. There's not much incentive politically to compromise, which is what you're supposed to do if you're in the Senate. I mean, the whole purpose there is to say, okay, we got a big problem here, say immigration. How are we going to work this out? And we can't work it out unless we all give a little and come up with a result that most of us can vote for and that most people will accept.
Mhm. At one point in the book, you wrote about your relationships with the presidents you've worked with as a senator, and you said you had really good relationships with both the Obama and the Trump administrations, which some people might find it surprising. But what you said is that you felt they came to the same conclusion that you did, which is that after the voters decide, we should respect each other's offices and do things together when we can. And when I read that, I was wondering if maybe you might have been projecting some of your institutional respect and your pragmatism onto Obama and maybe particularly Donald Trump, who honestly to me seems to have less respect for Congress as an institution than any president I can recall.
Well, you described my view of it pretty well. First I had to learn to work with President Obama, with whose liberal views I didn't agree.
Sure.
And then I had to learn to work with President Trump, with whose behavior and temperament I didn't agree. And the way I did that was simply to say what you just said, which was the people elected the president. They elected me. They expect us to work together when we can and show respect for the office. Abraham Lincoln said, sometimes the voters back up too close to the fire and burn their britches. And when they do, they just have to sit on their blisters. So I could have just gone around complaining about all of Obama's liberal views or all of Trump's behavior, but I didn't think that was a very useful way to spend my time. I could stay home and make a speech and do that. So I worked at working with them. I mean, with Obama was, to take him as an example, took a while to be able to work with him. He got elected with big majorities. He didn't think he needed to be bipartisan, didn't act like it. He did appoint some Republicans to his first cabinet, but basically his agenda was liberal and partisan because he had the votes. And he also was kind of clumsy at working with congressional relations. And it's an odd thing to say about a little bit of an introvert in a way. But by the time I got to be chairman of the committee and he was in his last 2 years, where we worked closely together on fixing No Child Left Behind. We worked on reducing student loans. We worked on something called 21st Century Cures, which moved medicines into patients' lives. Mm-hmm. He called them Christmas miracles. He deserves a lot of credit for the way he conducted himself in that, and we got a good result. With Trump, Trump was different, but we worked together on a number of things, from surprise medical billing to simplifying federal aid forms for college students. Maybe the biggest one was the Great American Outdoors Act. He told me one time, flying in Tennessee to see a tornado damage in Cookeville, he looked out and said, Tennessee's a beautiful state. We're in the presidential helicopter. He said, everyone in Tennessee loves me. And then he looked at me and said, except you, Lamar. And I said, Mr. President, we have an excellent relationship, because just that day on Air Force One, he had agreed to expand the Great American Outdoors Act to include all public lands. And when he signed it a few months later, he said it was the most important conservation law ever. So he was very proud of it, and we worked on it together. And I didn't the difference was I didn't criticize President Obama or President Trump personally, and they didn't criticize me personally either. I disagreed with them. I voted against both of them. I argued with them privately, with Trump about tariffs, with Obama about taxes. But I did it. I did it with respect, and I think that makes a difference.
I get the sense that one of the problems with the Senate these days is a decline in the number of what I'll call pragmatic institutionalists. I mean, I would put you in that camp and so many of the names of the folks that you mentioned, but it seems like they're kind of a dying breed really on both sides of the aisle. Is that right in your sense?
I think it is right. Now, it doesn't have to be. There are plenty of competent people there who could be more institutionally oriented and who could stick up for the Congress's prerogatives under Article 1 on taxes and tariffs and declaration of war and other things, but they're not doing it. At least they're not doing it as much as they wish they would.
Yeah. Uh, at one chapter in your book, you called Finest Hour or Lack of Spine. And you noted the really different reactions to your impeachment vote. And so I wanted, of course, you knew I was going to ask you about this, but why did you see it as an act of what I think, as you called in the book, constitutional wisdom to end the trial before hearing from witnesses who at least claim to have had firsthand knowledge of the president's actions?
Well, the phrase constitutional wisdom was the National Review's description of my vote.
Okay. Okay, sorry about
I
that.
didn't accuse myself of constitutional wisdom. I thought I was right. But here's what I did. The first impeachment trial, which was the only one I was in the Senate for,
Mhm.
was about a pretty narrow question. He was indicted or impeached by the House for two reasons, really. There was a frivolous third reason, but for two reasons. One was a telephone call to President Zelensky of Ukraine, in which he urged him to investigate his political opponent, Joe Biden. And then second, threatening to withhold American military aid from Ukraine if he didn't announce an investigation into Biden. I listened to all the evidence. I insisted that we have a vote on whether there be more evidence. And I came to the conclusion we didn't need any more evidence, which was the vote that basically ended the trial, according to Peter Baker in the New York Times. And here's why I voted that way. Trump himself admitted that he called Zelensky and urged him to announce an investigation of Biden. There were mountains of evidence that he uh, threatened to withhold American aid unless they announced an investigation of Biden. And I thought there was no doubt that Trump did what he was accused of doing. The question in the end, does that rise to the level of a high crime or misdemeanor? But on the question of whether we needed more evidence, I thought we don't need any more evidence. We've had so much evidence that he did it that it's clear that he did it. Why do you need, if you've got 8 witnesses to a hit and run accident, why do you need 9?
Sure.
So I thought we didn't need more evidence because what Trump did was already proved. So I voted no, we don't need more evidence. And that then presented the question of then if he did it, should he be convicted?
Right. Now, in your, I think it was your farewell address, you warned that, in your words, today we have too much pluribus and not enough unum. And now I'm wondering, though, if the Senate's own rules, like the filibuster, maybe most prominently, kind of prevent some of that unum by allowing a minority to block a lot of popular legislation, aside from some reconciliation things here and there, which is its own weird thing. Why shouldn't the Senate abolish the filibuster altogether?
Well, let me give credit to Ken Burns and Arthur Schlesinger, who are the ones who said too much pluribus unum. They're talking about our country first motto, which is, from many one, pluribus unum. But I disagree with your point on the filibuster. The filibuster is what encourages unum, because what the filibuster does is say that 60 of the 100 senators have to agree before you can take up a bill on immigration or sending education back to the states. So, for example, when I introduce in committee with Patty Murray my education bill to fix No Child Left Behind, and she says, no, we're not going to do it that way. I have to pay attention to her, or it'll never come to the floor because it'll never get 60 votes. She'll get all the Democrats to vote against it, and we haven't ever had 60 Republicans in the history of the Senate, I don't think. So what the Senate filibuster rule does is it forces Patty Murray and me, or the leaders of any other committee, to keep talking until they find a solution that enough of them agree on, that most of them will vote for, and that the country will accept. We did that in 2014 on immigration. People forget this, but the Senate, with McCain and Kennedy and a lot of us, 68 of us voted not just to secure the southern border, but to create a legal status for the 12, 13, 14 million people who are here illegally, but who've never committed any crime. That's what we need to do as a country. And that, if you tried to cram that down the American people with a majority vote, you'd get a rebellion. But if you get 68 or 70 or 75 of the senators voting for that, then the country will accept it.
Yeah. And well, you actually closed the book by calling for more builders. And that kind of, when I thought about builders in the Senate, it reminded me of the advice that at least it said Senator Sam Rayburn, a great lion of the Senate, gave to at the time a young Lyndon Johnson. He said, any jackass can kick down a barn, but it takes a good carpenter to build one. And I wonder if we're at a point where the incentives of what you call in the book digital democracy so favor those jackasses over those carpenters that we're in this sort of downward spin we don't know how to recover from.
That's true. We are. But that's the challenge. That's an opportunity. In the prologue of my book, I write about how Doris Kearns Goodwin said that Lincoln thought, when he got into politics in the 1830s and 40s, that the founders had solved all the problems and there was nothing left for him to do. Well, young people today have the same opportunity Abraham Lincoln did a long time ago. There's a lot to fix today. And I was with a group of students in the Howard H. Baker School of Public Policy yesterday, and I said, the problem is the algorithm. The problem is the social media. It drives people to the extremes. They just sit around and talk to each other about things in groups about if they agree with each other. They've forgotten how to even disagree. I can remember when I saw Hubert Humphrey, the liberal senator, and John Tower, the conservative senator, have a huge debate on the Senate floor about labor policy. And after it was over, they went over and hugged each other. I mean, they knew how to disagree, even though they continued to disagree. So I think the challenge for young people or older people is to say, well, we can't tolerate this situation where we've got a country that needs to solve some big problems, debt, immigration, many other issues. And that requires people talking to each other and understanding that, as Senator Baker used to say, the other fellow might be right or the other lady might be right, and getting a result. I don't know any way to do it. If I knew how to do that, if I were 25 or 30, I'd figure out how to do that and run for office. And I think what I would do is I would figure out how to use social media to tame social media. In other words, since about 5% of the registered voters often pick the nominees in party primaries, and they're too far to the left, too far to the right, so that people who are center-left or center-right are just left out. Reagan Republicans left out. Humphrey Democrats left out. I would try to use social media to get into the primaries more center-left and center-right voters and produce nominees who give you someone to vote for in the general election if you want a nominee or a senator or governor who will spend his or her time trying to get a result instead of making a speech.
Before we wrap up, I want to ask you one kind of wonky, sort of semi-wonky process question. It goes back to the filibuster in a way. I'm actually a fan of the filibuster, and I was very disappointed when it was removed for nominations. I think that was a bad idea. But I'm wondering, do you think that there's a possibility? It seems like there's no stomach in the Senate to want to just end the filibuster entirely. But do you think there's the possibility that there might be more carve-outs made, say, for voting legislation or national security legislation, and it eventually just gets whittled down to almost nothing? I mean, I hope not, but you would know better than I would.
Well, no, I think that'll be the pressure. Of course, the Democrats have made it an article of faith to get rid of the filibuster, which is astonishing, really, because right now, the Democrats' only weapon against Donald Trump is the filibuster. The fact that it takes 60 votes in the Senate to pass a major piece of legislation is the only way the Democrats could keep Trump proposals from roaring through the House and roaring through the Senate like a freight train. To the last person, they want to get rid of the filibuster. The ones who are keeping the filibuster are the Republican institutionalists who understand that it's what makes the Senate the Senate. It creates an environment in which senators have to keep talking until they can come to a conclusion on how do you pass an American Outdoors Act? How do you pass 21st Century Cures? What's the right War Powers Act? What's the right legislation on education? We need more Democratic institutionalists who will protect the filibuster, in my view.
Yeah. So, just a couple quick things before we go. What would you say is the biggest misconception people have, or the one thing you would like them to know about how American politics actually works they might not know?
I would like for Americans to know that it works pretty much the way your family works or your Sunday school works or your business works, that it is based primarily on relationships. And at least once you get elected, I'm talking about, it's based on relationships. And just as I was talking about having the senators come down and spend the weekend with us, so we get to know them, learn to trust each other, discover where there might be something we agree on, or that's not brain surgery. And it's not just something that happens in politics. It happens in every phase of American life. So the way to succeed once you get into office is simply to be an eloquent listener and to think that the other person might occasionally be right. As Senator Baker used to say, getting into office today is harder because you're going to have to figure out how do you tame this social medium phenomena. But I think there are enough smart, young, entrepreneurial politicians who can figure out how to do that. 50 years ago, a bunch of us got together and figured out how to make Tennessee a two-party state when it was all Democratic. Now it's all Republican. So there ought to be enough smart young Democrats in our state and other states who can say, well, we don't think a one-party rule produces good government. We want to change that. We think social media is a big part of the problem, and we're going to fix that. That's a challenge. That's a challenge the next generation needs to take.
I always like to end on an optimistic note if at all possible. So when you look out at the current state of American politics, what, if anything, gives you at least some cause or some hope for the future?
Well, the title to my prologue is The Republic Will Survive, the prologue to my book. I borrowed that phrase from Senator Howard Baker. He would always say whenever there was a war or a particularly obstinate senator or some problem, he would say, the Republic will survive. What gives me optimism is that we're a big, complex, successful country. We produce every year 5% of all the money in the world for about 4% of the people. We have the strongest military, the best universities. We're the most entrepreneurial. We produce vaccines faster than anybody. We invented the national park system. I mean, there's no recipe for despair. This is a country where millions want to come. One of our biggest problems is that so many people want to come here. They're not trying to leave here. So I'm optimistic because we're blessed, really, with all of those advantages. What we need to do is what Archibald MacLeish wrote in his poem about World War II veterans when they came back. It said, in effect, we've given you your country, now it's up to you what to do with it. So it's up to the 500,000 people who are in elective office today to make something of it. And the whole purpose of my book was to try to persuade the reader, hopefully inspire the reader. What I learned and what Bill Frist found out is that the most reliable way to help the most people and to keep our contentious digital democracy from falling apart is to figure out how to get elected to public office or go to work for someone else who has been.
Yeah. And again, that book is The Education of a Senator. And Senator Lamar Alexander, it has been such a pleasure talking to you today.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to this Politics Guys interview. If you have a question or comment for us, we'd love to hear from you. You can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. If you're not already a supporter of the show, we hope you'll consider becoming one. Supporters get ad-free versions of everything we release, our full-length midweek episode instead of just a preview, and access to our Politics Guys Discord group. It's a fun place with a great bunch of people. You can support us on Patreon, where you can even sign up for a free trial. And if Patreon isn't your thing, or you're a current supporter and want to give us a little extra one-shot contribution, you can support us on PayPal and Venmo too. You'll find links to all our support options at politicsguys.com/support and in the show notes. If you'd like to get our full-length midweek episodes, but you're not in a position to financially support the podcast right now, just email me. I'm at mike@politicsguys.com, and I will be happy to get that set up for you. And whether you're a supporter or not, we'd appreciate it if you could subscribe, rate, and review us on whatever podcast app you use, as well as sharing episodes on social media. And finally, a very special thanks to our wonderful executive producers. They are Wilma Moreno, Daniel Toe, Ryan Beasley, Don Oglesby, Derek Schmidt, Dakota Heath, Jason Chrysler, Dave Dean, Jeremy Larson, Brian Matza, and Jody Marie Miller.
This podcast is part of the Democracy Group,